Hello again, everyone. This is the first video from the second series of educational PvP videos I promised to make. The first series is almost done. In this video, I will go over the basic mechanics, map layout, and winning objective for PvP domination matches. I will also give you a starter overview of some of the more advanced PvP concepts and handy gameplay tips. This video will also include some general rules of thumb on the do's and don'ts for PvP, as well as some of the exceptions to those rules. Although this guide was created in late Module 21, most of the info in this guide will probably stay good for a lot longer than that. As a heads up, I won't be giving you any text blocks today to read, so make sure to listen closely. I will put the script for this video in the video description for people who are looking to verify what their ears heard. Now on to the content. There are 3 PvP domination maps you could get when you queue for PvP. Hotenow Domination, Rivenscar Runes, and Stardock Arena. The map I'm on is Hotenow Domination. No matter which of these maps you get, there will be a total of 3 nodes on the map. Nodes are the big circular discs that you'll see on the ground in 3 different locations on the map. If you look at your mini-map, or the teardrop icons, those also show you where the nodes are. Each of the 3 nodes has a number on it, 1, 2, or 3. Hotenow Domination and Rivenscar Runes have a very similar layout to each other for their node and spawn placements. There is a side node that is close to your team's spawn area, which is this one. And there's another side node that is close to the enemy team's spawn area. The middle node is always the one labeled 2, and it's in the dead center of the map. Stardock Arena has a different layout than the other 2 maps. Both of the team's spawn zones are located in the center of this map, and all 3 nodes on this map are side nodes that are equally far apart from each other. Now, I can't go show you Stardock without leaving this map and messing some things up, so you'll have to take my word for it for Stardock Arena. Now, these differences in map layout affect a lot of things, from which classes do the best on certain maps, which weapon enchantments are optimal, and the opening strategy for how to play these maps. PvP maps also spawn potions that you can walk into. Notably, Stardock has an extra potion type that the other 2 maps don't have. Stardock is the only map that can spawn the yellow potions that refill some of your action points. The other 2 maps only spawn the red healing potions, like the one I just took. Now, give me a moment. I've got to stop this node from aggressing any further.
Your team dominates.
Now, if you look at the red and blue bars on the right side of your screen, the ones that I'm circling, those are the point tallies for each team. The first team to reach 1,000 points wins the match. This is the winning objective. Think of it in terms of gaining points, instead of in The blue bar for your team and the blue bar is for your team and the red bar is for the enemy team. So that one that says 40 points is the blue bar. The 337 would be the enemy team. As some extremely important information, the only way to generate points towards the winning objective in PvP matches is to own a node. You don't get any points from kills. The other kind of points you get, you see being generated when you kill someone, such as plus 50 for tower rush or plus 100 for killing someone, are personal score points, which have no effect whatsoever on the winning objective. You also gain these personal score points from capping nodes. I don't recommend trying to get the highest personal score unless you need more glory to buy healing potions with. These things down here. Those personal scores are mostly meaningless. Trying to get the highest personal score can also be counterproductive to actually winning the match. There are a lot of selfish actions you could take to boost your personal score that end up giving the enemy team more points towards the objective. That, and you always want your focus to be on playing the best you can directly, instead of trying to chase after distraction goals like this one. With that in mind, let's go over how to capture a node for your team. All nodes at the start of a match are gray. Gray nodes are unclaimed and don't generate points for anyone. When you or a teammate stand on the node, a blue meter will appear on the border of that node's teardrop icon. This blue meter gradually progresses all the way around the teardrop over the course of around 20-something seconds. The 20-something seconds estimate assumes there is only one player standing on the node. If multiple players from your team stand on the node, your team will capture the node a lot faster. Now, once the blue meter makes it all the way around the teardrop, the node will turn blue. Any nodes that are blue like this are nodes that your team currently owns. Similarly, if you see a teardrop icon with a red meter on the border, it means the enemy team is in the progress of capping that node. Once the red meter makes it all the way around the teardrop, that node will turn red. Red nodes are nodes that the enemy team currently owns. Members of opposing teams can attempt to slow down or drain each other's cap progress by moving on to the node. If one team outnumbers the other team on a node for a long enough period of time, they will capture the node. The larger the numbers advantage is, the faster the node caps. Now, as a helpful tip, you can watch how fast the teardrop meter is progressing to get a rough idea of how many players are standing on the node, even if you aren't nearby. This info can help you make better decisions on where to go. As another bit of less well-known information, you can actually steal another team's cap progress for a gray node. So this little blue bar, another team could step onto the node and steal it, which allows your team to cap that node instead and do so much faster than normal. This is called pre-capping. I'll be covering this more in more detail in a later video. Now, I can't really show it to you because there's nobody on the enemy team on the map with me for me to demonstrate it for you. But there will be a later video on specifically pre-capping. When your team owns a node, that node will automatically generate points for your team over time, slowly filling up the winning objective bar for your team that I mentioned earlier. Now, each additional node that your team owns speeds up how fast your team generates points. These same rules apply for the enemy team. In a nutshell, In order to win a PvP match, your team must own more nodes than the enemy team does for a majority of the match. Usually the wisest course of action is to capture and then defend 2 nodes for most of the match. In most situations, it is risky and unnecessary to try to capture all 3 nodes. There are exceptions, though, to the above, such as trying to catch up to an enemy team that is so far ahead of you in points that your only chance of winning would be to triple cap. Another exception is when your team is completely steamrolling the enemy team due to the matchmaking being unbalanced in your team's favor. In a situation like this, your team can just take everything. A third exception is if your team is too weak to defend nodes for long and your only chance of winning is to keep capping and hope the enemy team is only able to recapture or contest 1 node at a time. Now, if your team has any number greater than 500 points, and the enemy team has less than half of the points your team has, then your team can win the match by holding only 1 node for the rest of the match. That actually applies almost right now. Like, I'd actually say, yeah, it's pretty much right now. This, if you see the domination bar, this is an example of it. Another scenario you can win with only 1 node in is if your team is really close to reaching the the 1,000 points goal, and the enemy team doesn't have enough time to catch up. Let's say your team had 950 points, and the enemy team only has 700 points as an example. Even with 2 nodes, the enemy team isn't going to hit 1,000 points before your team does. In order to stop an enemy node from generating points for the enemy team, you have 2 options. Number 1 is to capture the enemy node. Number 2 is to force the enemy node into a contested state. Now, this next bit of info is very important and is often overlooked. Simply equalizing the number of ally and enemy players on a node doesn't stop the node from generating points. This means that if you wanted to stop an enemy node from generating points, your team would have to outnumber the enemy team on that node. Doing so keeps the node in a partially capped state and stops it from generating points. If your team has 2 nodes and you wanted to maximize your team's lead in points over the enemy team, but can't afford to have your teammates gone long enough to actually capture a 3rd node, you can send someone to harass that remaining red node and try to keep putting it into a contested state. Now that I've thoroughly explained nodes, I will discuss the best opening strategies for each map. Give me a second to respawn. When you queue for Domination, there will be a countdown shortly after spawning onto the map. Once the countdown is over, the gates will drop and both teams will leave the spawn zone. The gate's down right now, as you can see, but it would normally be up when you queue onto the map for the first time. Okay, so after leaving the spawn zone... Okay, and make sure you get down immediately. PvP matches are fast-paced, and you don't have time to sit in spawn and fiddle with your powers or whatever else you forgot to do beforehand. If you get plopped onto Rivenscar Runes or Hotenow Domination, the best place for every single member of both teams to go after the gates drop is usually the middle node. The first team to capture the middle node and successfully kill someone can then send a player or 2 to go try to capture one of the side nodes. Make sure you don't send too many players away at once if there are still enemies on the middle node. The team that loses this squabble will have to either retake the middle node while also capturing a side node, or they will have to split up and try to take the 2 side nodes. The middle node is usually considered to be the most valuable node to control, since it gives your team more control over the flow of the game and shortens the travel distance for your team. However, this advantage often get overemphasized, especially on PC. The points are the same no matter which node you own. So if you had an experienced team that was flexible at controlling side nodes and ignoring the middle node for most of the match, there isn't anything wrong with this as long as your team handles it in a controlled way. Doing something like this opens up more possibilities for countering enemy rangers in particular. To address a common mistake a lot of new players make, the reason it's usually bad when a player on your team starts the match by trying to cap the home node by themselves is because it often causes your team to lose the fight on mid, and then the enemies have time to send someone to your home node before your teammate can finish capping it. If your teammate dies quickly to that enemy or runs away, the enemy will take over the node capping progress for that gray node and cap it nearly instantly. Having multiple teammates try to cap the home node first is usually also bad, because your team will still lose out on a chance to take the middle node, and will lose some momentum, which can make it hard to put the enemy back on the defensive again. Having any number of teammates cap home node at the start like this can be a good strategy in some cases. For example, if your team isn't strong enough to take over the middle node when all of the enemies are together. But decisions like these are in the minority and should be left in the hands of experienced players. As another pro tip to mention, if your team captures the middle node at the start of the match, and the other two nodes are still gray, your team shouldn't move until the enemy team does. In this situation, your team doesn't have to cap any side nodes if the enemy team isn't trying to cap any side nodes. If you do see an enemy trying to cap a gray side node, follow them instead of trying to cap the vacant gray node. Notably, the Stardock Arena map doesn't have a middle node at all. This does change the ideal opening strategy some for this map. If you are on Stardock, I recommend splitting into two groups and capping two different nodes at once at the start of the match. Most likely you want a group of 2 and a group of 3, and to pay attention to where the enemy team went. Now that I've discussed opening strategies, here is another rule of thumb. As a really important guideline to know, you want to fight on the nodes as much as possible. Your team usually needs your butt on the nodes in order to successfully cap and hold nodes. If you fight off node too much or allow yourself to get distracted by things like chasing kills off node for prolonged periods of time, then your team is effectively going to be outnumbered on the nodes, and this will contribute to losing the match. The same thing goes for trying to fight on top of the pillars. This is a bad idea that will lead to your team getting outnumbered in like 99% of cases. Like there's pillars on the Domination map that I just left. You don't want to fight on top of those pillars. You want to be off the pillars most of the time. Now, there are of course exceptions to off-noding too, though. If you can make an equal or greater player than yourself fight off-node with you, then fighting off-node can be fine. Good players tend to be more comfortable with stepping off node to do various tasks and getting back onto the node at the right moments, rather than rigidly standing on the nodes 24/7. These good players will still usually be on the node the majority of the time, though. However, if you do choose to go off node, be mindful of how this is going to affect of how that is going to affect the other player's behavior on both teams. As 3 examples of what happens if you don't pay attention to this and you go off node a lot, your teammates may become nervous and distracted. You can end up reducing your team's ability to apply consistent pressure to the enemy team. And you can cause the enemy team to start targeting a different teammate that is still on the node and might not be able to take those hits. These behavior changes are something that healers that go off node a lot also need to take into account. It's not just a DPS player problem. What I just mentioned gets into player presence, pressure, and potency a little bit. More on this in later videos. Presence, pressure, and potency are pretty important concepts in PvP. Another important guideline is the following. If you have a choice between keeping a node your team owns blue for longer in PvP or escaping to preserve your own life, the rule of thumb for this is you should defend the node, even if it means dying more often. There are of course exceptions to this too though. If you find yourself trying to defend a node alone versus 3 enemies, and you can see that your teammates aren't going to arrive in time to help you save it, you should probably flee the scene and go make better use of your time elsewhere. Focus on what you can do in PvP, not on what you can't do. Time is of the essence, and the more time you spend not doing anything useful, the more likely your team is to lose ground. The exception to that exception is if you can successfully keep a large number of enemies distracted for a prolonged period of time, and your team doesn't need your help elsewhere. Yet another exception is when you can both defend a node and keep yourself alive. If you have a good grasp of the time it takes for a node to cap, you can flee temporarily or hide behind obstacles and then return to save the node before it caps. Return to the node to save it before it caps. You could also temporarily leave the node you were defending to go help your team on another node, and then go back to your node before the node caps. This requires some degree of trust from your teammates though. Oftentimes your teammates have no way of knowing if you will go back to your node, and they may try to intervene. Trying to do advanced stuff like this relies heavily on communication to pull off. Either that or cross your fingers your team doesn't move right then. Ideally, your whole team would use a voice program like Discord to communicate during PvP matches in general. This makes matches more fun, fosters a more relaxed atmosphere due to the increased trust, and it greatly improves your team's skill to do this regularly. People don't bother to use Discord for solo queue since solo queue teams are always randomized. Using Discord is more of a private match thing. Next up, we have arguably... give me a moment. Next up, we have arguably the most important rotating tip of them all. I rarely see anyone spell this tip out for people, and hearing it could make a lot of rotating information finally click for you. Never outnumber the enemy team on a blue node. I'll repeat that. Never outnumber the enemy team on a blue node. Your team should try to equalize the numbers on nodes your team controls whenever possible. As an example of this in action, if the enemy team sent 2 enemies to a blue node, your team should try to match that with 2 of your own teammates. Your team will continue to gain points since the node isn't being contested, and the enemy team won't be able to cap it until they either kill someone or one of your teammates leaves. Similarly, you should follow enemies that are approaching your blue nodes with an equal number of your own teammates. Sticking to this concept of equalizing the numbers when defending blue nodes ensures your team doesn't have any under-defended areas anywhere on the map for the enemy to take advantage of. The enemy team can't slaughter your team's out-of-position stragglers if your team doesn't have any out-of-position stragglers. One of the exceptions to the above is if one of your teammates is too weak to be left alone with an enemy player, and you end up needing to go help them. In this situation, it is a race against the clock to try to kill that enemy and then quickly leave before your team loses ground elsewhere. There is a lot of improvising that you'll end up needing to do in PvP, and this is one of those things. By now, you are probably seeing how complicated and situational every move you could make in PvP can be. There are generally wise guidelines you should be using most of the time, but as you get more experienced, you get better and better at seeing which situations you can disregard them in to get even better results than just going by rule of thumb. With all that talk of nodes from earlier, some of you may be wondering, what does fighting and killing enemies actually do in PvP? Since you don't get any points towards the winning objective from it. Fighting and killing are still very, very important. This is mostly because killing enemies helps your team outnumber and overpower the enemy team, which indirectly helps your team cap nodes and makes you more effective at winning matches. That and PvP wouldn't be PvP without some fighting now, would it? So if reaching 1000 points first via capping and holding nodes is the goal, killing enemies is one of the 3 most important tools at your disposal for helping you accomplish this. The other 2 main tools are crowd control effects and fast rotating. To most efficiently kill enemies, your team should ideally all attack the same enemy until dead, rinse and repeat. This is called focus killing. Usually you should either target the easiest person to kill or the most threatening enemy player that your team is capable of killing reliably. The best case scenario is your team is able and willing to kill the enemy team's only healer, but this is also usually the hardest player to kill. Some classes are better able to handle killing enemies by themselves than others, but generally teamwork is key. Your team should also try to kill enemies while traveling in between nodes. Likewise, you will often need to defend your teammates when moving in between nodes, so that you all make it there safely. To do this, you can use crowd control effects, you can body block for your teammates, you can do a lot of damage to enemies to put them on the defensive. You could cast healing spells, etc. What I just described is called peeling. Yes, peeling, like a banana. I don't know where that got started, but there you go. However, you shouldn't spend too much time trying to prevent enemies from stepping onto the node. You should make a quick attempt to kill enemies in between nodes. But if they don't die fast, drop what you are doing and just cut straight to the node. Especially if you have a teammate waiting for you on the node to help you cap it. A very common mistake players make is getting too stubborn and holding an enemy off node and out of reach of their teammate for a prolonged period of time. It is usually much better to bring the enemy to your teammate on the node and kill that enemy together than it is to try to duel someone off node for a long time while your teammate tries to cap alone. If you duel someone off node, that also gives the enemy team a lot more time to send another enemy to stop you guys from securing the cap. You may have noticed me mention travel time a few times. This is also important to be aware of in PvP. You always want to take the shortest route to get to nodes. For most players in most situations, you don't want to waste time traveling through the back alleys or running across those useless bridges. The more specific rule is there is a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. It can be faster to use the back alley if you are able to stay mounted the whole time. You don't hesitate or delay at all in the process of making this decision. You don't stop to pick up a potion, and there is a big fight taking place in between two and the side node that could cause you to be dismounted otherwise. You could also use this route on the way to defend if you have a really good grasp of the time it takes for a node to cap, and the node is very early into being capped. However, if there is a big fight going on in between nodes like this, you may want to consider helping your team clear enemies on your way to the node, instead of trying to truck it through the back alleys. Healing potions and action point potions do spawn in those long routes, but almost all of these are too far away to be worth going after, and picking up potions is usually not instant since they are sensitive to movement. It is almost always more efficient to just use your personal PvP healing potions, stand near your team's healer, or simply die and respawn than it is to try to go get those far away healing potion spawns. One exception is the potion spawn in the dead center of the Stardock map. One exception is the potion spawn in the dead center of the Stardock arena map. You usually can grab this potion when traveling in between nodes. You can also leave a node you own that you were 1 versus 1ing on, grab this potion, and come back before the node caps. Travel time also becomes important when your teammates die. As an example, if a teammate dies on the far node, and the far node is blue, then a teammate on the middle node should rotate to the far node to replace the teammate that just died. When the dead teammate respawns, that teammate should go to the middle node to fill in for their teammate that just left. This is because the way respawn timers work makes it so there is a good chance that someone who just respawned won't have time to run all the way across the map to prevent the far node from being taken. Speaking of respawn timers in PvP are rolling 20-second intervals. They aren't actually random at all. Respawn timers in the background start at 20 seconds and tick down by 1 each second until it reaches 0. Then a new 20-second interval starts. At any given moment, everyone on the map has the same respawn timer. So if multiple people died at the exact same time, all of them would get the same respawn timer as each other. For example, let's say everyone died during the same second, and all of them got a 7-second respawn timer. As another example of respawn timers in action, if you had 2 people die at separate times from each other, but they still both died within the same 20-second interval, then both of them will respawn at the same time. Let's say someone died and got a 10-second respawn timer, and then 5 seconds later, another person dies. That second person will get a 5-second respawn timer. So both of these people are going to respawn at the same time. If 2 players die more than 20 seconds apart, then for sure they won't die within the same interval as each other. So they will for sure respawn at different times. If a player was to die and get a 4-second respawn timer, and 5 seconds later another person died. Let me repeat that, I'm not sure I was clear there. If a player was to die and get a 4-second respawn timer, and 5 seconds later another person died, then that unlucky motherfucker just got a 20-second respawn timer because they died right at the start of a new interval. Here is another handy tip. One of the many visual indicators you could use to see when a new interval has just started is watching for dead bodies disappearing. When a dead body disappears like this, that marks the start of a new interval. These rolling respawn timers are also the reason why spacing apart your kills instead of killing a lot of enemies within a very short time span is generally good practice for defending nodes successfully. Being more patient like this can help you defend a node by yourself and also helps prevent your team from getting overwhelmed by a stampede of full HP enemies. Now you've heard about situations earlier where you want to kill enemies. But what about situations where you don't want to kill any enemies? These certainly exist too. If you are still new and inexperienced, I would suggest always choosing to kill the enemy when you get the opportunity to do so. The majority of the time, this is the right thing to do. If you are a really experienced player, you may notice when the enemy team keeps getting a streak of lucky respawn timers for most of the match. The way to stop this from happening is to deliberately stop killing for a bit and then start killing at different moments than you were before until you break the pattern. As another example, you sometimes end up with situations where you want to wait a bit before killing anyone because you don't want to risk sending any enemies to the far node at a bad time. Let's say your teammates were trying to cap the far node, for example, and you have the option to kill someone elsewhere. You probably should wait to kill so you don't teleport that enemy closer to where the far node is before your teammates can finish capping it. As a third example of this, if your team is in advantageous matchups all across the map, your team has 2 blue nodes, and nobody on your team is at risk of dying, you might not want to kill any enemies, since doing so could move that enemy somewhere that is less advantageous to your team. Now I will cover backcapping. Backcapping is when one player quietly slips away from the rest of the group to go cap a node by themselves. If your teammate is attempting to backcap the enemy, only help them if your team is behind in node count. So if your team only owns 1 node, then you should help them. Otherwise, don't. There is an exception to this where sometimes you do get enough time to briefly help someone cap a 3rd node. But it's a risky move always, and if you attempt this, be prepared to book it back to your team's blue nodes at the first sign of trouble. Another thing I'll touch on here is how different roles should rotate in PvP. DPS roles should be the most mobile players on their team. They should ideally rotate ahead of the healer. The DPS role's job is to cap nodes and defend nodes. Squishy DPS players usually utilize a smash and grab approach and avoid prolonged fights. They swoop in, kill an enemy fast, and then hightail it somewhere else if they can afford to leave. Tanky DPS players can successfully defend nodes for a prolonged period of time if they so choose. Tanky DPS players are more likely to be dispatched to defend their team's home node as well. For DPS roles, there are 2 additional rotating strategies I can describe for specifically squishy DPS players. One strategy is for a DPS player to utilize the drag line concept and try to force the fight onto the enemy side of the map. Think of it like you have a clothesline stretching out on either side of you, and you are trying to move that line as far onto the enemy side of the map as possible. Another way to think about it is herding the enemies back onto their side of the map with your presence. A common manifestation of this strategy is the far node strat. This is when a DPS player spends most of their time on the far node, or moving from middle node to far node and then back to middle again a lot. This strategy is very aggressive and often pays off against weak or inexperienced teams. But on the downside, it can make you overly afraid to respond to nodes that need your help for fear of reducing momentum, or getting trapped in a 1 versus 1, especially your team's home node. The second strategy is for a player to spend most of their time on... give me a moment. The second strategy is for a player to spend most of their time on the middle node, killing enemy after enemy, while also trying to prevent enemies from reaching your team's home node at all costs. This strategy is more secure and tends to pay off against more experienced teams that still have a lot of killable players on them. Always remember that the very best rotating is more fluid than any rigid strategy I could describe for you, though. You won't be using either of these strategies 100% of the time because everything in PvP is situational. Moving on to how healers rotate now. The healer's job is primarily to secure their team and keep them alive. Healers generally should go to where the largest group of their teammates are by default, and respond to the side nodes from time to time as needed, specifically to either heal teammates or help them cap. Healers should never be sent to cap nodes by themselves because they lack the ability to kill enemies. Healers also shouldn't be left alone for a prolonged period of time. If they are tied up somewhere alone, that means they aren't healing their teammates, which will probably lead to some costly deaths. As another pro rotation tip, a really powerful move for wizards and experienced DPS players is to rotate to where their team's low health bars are a lot. This is strong for a number of reasons. It puts you on the same rotation path as the healer, and it also reinforces your team. Pure tanks are the least useful role in PvP, but can be a beginner-friendly option. They should only defend blue nodes and help their teammates cap. Again, this is because they lack the ability to kill enemies. Tanks can optionally equip themselves with extra control effects to help them defend their teammates as a cherry on top. Additionally, every single class and build in this game has some degree of rock, paper, scissors going on. Every class has classes they are strong against and classes they are disadvantaged against. However, if a class is overpowered, this can reduce these weaknesses to a barely noticeable point. Some builds are better equipped to fight certain other builds than others. There are also additional layers to this, such as player experience, player tankiness, crowd control, the current meta, etc. One of the many parts of rotating in PvP is being aware of which teammates are safe to send to fight or stalemate specific enemies and reacting accordingly. While I'm at it, I will address a common misconception. Some players assume that a DPS teammate paired with a teammate that is super tanky and can't kill anyone must be better than having two DPS teammates paired with each other. This was true to an extent in past metas where player damage was much higher than it is today, and people could kill by themselves more. Right now this isn't the case for pure tank plus a DPS at all. And even a healer paired with a DPS can be a double-edged sword depending on which DPS class it is. A pure tank paired with a squishy DPS is actually quite bad compared to other options, because most likely the enemies will both gang up on the DPS player, and the DPS player will likely need help from another DPS teammate to kill enemies. There are still some good examples of mismatched builds being better than two of the same kind, though. For example, having both a Whisper Knife rogue and an Assassin rogue is stronger than having two of the same kind of rogue. Having an Initiator class paired with a class that excels at attacking last is also a good strategy in most cases. For example, Fighter plus Barbarian or Wizard plus Rogue. High damage builds tend to be the best competitive builds in PvP, but they are usually more expensive to make, and they usually aren't as beginner friendly as a tanky build. You don't want your high damage builds to be totally made of glass though. They do need some survivability in order to avoid dying too much or dying at really bad times. Tanky DPS players with very blunt, underwhelming damage can still kill inexperienced, squishy players. But having too many of these bruiser builds on a team at once will reduce your team's effectiveness at winning games if you are matched against a good team. This is because clearing enemies isn't a one-man job. Your whole team is supposed to help with it, and if only one or two DPS players get left with this job, they are going to be under a lot of strain, and your team probably won't be able to kill often enough. If your team has really low damage like this, then y'all will have to rotate really fast and really well for the entire match. If your team loses a node, then it's going to be really hard to get that node back. In this situation, it is essential that your team caps 2 nodes at the start and doesn't lose them. As yet another extra tip, when a teammate gives you directions in the chat, you want to listen in most cases. But don't follow blindly. Pay attention to your surroundings, in case there is something the person giving you directions missed. When a player tells their team to go to specific nodes, they usually don't mean for literally everyone to go there at once. If the direction giver doesn't specify a number of teammates or address specific players in their message, they are drawing attention to a situation that needs addressing and hoping the appropriate number of teammates react fast enough to it. Don't misinterpret what I just said about not following blindly, though. Any plan is still better than no plan, so even if the directions you are getting aren't the very best, everyone working together is still better than anyone on your team being really obstinate and trying to go against the grain. So if your team has disagreements on strategy, it's usually best to discuss those after the match. Here is a really good tip you can use to help you avoid following directions blindly. If you are leaving a blue node to go somewhere else, remember to glance behind you in case you have to go back. To address a few more common mistakes, when on a team that is close to winning, many players get nervous close to the end of the match and suddenly try to change things up for no reason or just kind of freeze up and stop paying attention to what they are doing. Changing your behavior suddenly without communicating it to the rest of your team can be really disruptive and lead to a chain reaction that costs you the match. If your team has got a routine down that is working really well, just keep doing that until the match ends. Pretend like it's any other part of the match. That said, being unpredictable is very useful when applied to certain areas, but it needs to be done in a controlled way and not just because you had a compulsion to change things up for no reason. Many teams make a different mistake when they are winning by a landslide. They assume they've got the match in the bag and they start slacking off. If this persists for too long, the enemy team can steal the match right from under you guys. As a bit of common match etiquette that is somewhat related to what I just said, many players deliberately stop attacking on and off as a courtesy in super unbalanced matches, so they don't scare off new players. If your team is letting the enemy team get some free caps for boons like this, just remember to keep a careful eye on things and make sure your team still wins the match at the end. You don't want to breed entitlement from feeding people wins they didn't earn, but you don't want to ruthlessly farm the helpless in bad taste either. A third mistake a lot of players make is giving up too early because a match looks like it is a hopeless loss for their team. Assuming you are geared enough for it to matter, this is a bad habit to be in, and it does cost you opportunities to win that will add up over time. Long story short, don't get cocky, don't panic, don't rage quit, don't despair, and keep your eye on the ball. The best way to maximize your effectiveness at winning matches is to consistently play your best from start to finish, no matter how easy or hopeless the match looks. And remember, the only way to really get anywhere in PvP is by a combination of luck, build, and playing well consistently. You can only control two of those variables. In matches, try to focus on your own actions, self-improvement, even when you are 100% certain it wasn't you that caused the loss. You can't make your teammates play well. You can only be the best teammate you can and cross your fingers for the rest. As a minor exception, it is possible to use some field manipulation and leadership techniques to bolster your teammates' performance during matches. So technically, you can make your teammates play better. This is pretty advanced stuff though, and you still don't want to dilute your focus by getting too sucked into what your teammates are doing. Here is another useful tip. Another helpful tip. I hope my explanation makes sense to you guys. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed during a match, like it feels like there's too much going on and you are fumbling your attacks a lot, slow your actions down a little bit so your head has time to clear up and plan your next moves more carefully for your next series of actions. Doing this reduces the pressure you apply to enemies and lowers your reaction speed some, but it helps you be more calculated and reliable. Once you feel comfortable again, gradually turn up the heat and start playing in a more energetic and aggressive way. The above gets into utilizing emotional states, discipline, awareness, and perception and playstyle shifts a tiny bit. What I just described above is just the tip of the iceberg for what you can do with psychological stuff in PvP. On a closing note, a good approach to many situations, especially ones where you don't have enough intel on what is going on, is to wait for more info to unfold in front of you and then respond to the situation. A great example of this is when you're trying to figure out which nodes need your help. In a situation like in this situation, you can float for a moment in between the nodes and wait for the allies and enemies to settle onto the nodes without you. Then you'll be able to see where to go. That is all for now, guys. See you next time. As a reminder, you can find the written script for this video in the video description, for those of you who want to verify what your ears heard.